Hello and welcome to this tutorial, and in this tutorial we are basically going to learn how we could design Android applications using PHP and MySQL. So basically in this set of tutorials we are basically going to learn how to develop Android applications and use the MySQL database in order to basically store the data onto an online server so as to basically make the application access data from the server whenever we need it. So if we want to actually design an Android application, the Android application actually consists of three main parts. So the very first part is basically the graphical user interface of our application. So the graphical user interface of our application is nothing but the look and feel of the application, such as the menu items, the buttons, and all that kinds of stuff. And the next part of our application is actually the the core logic. So let's go ahead and list some of the parts of our Android application. So the very first part is going to be the user interface. So user interface is one of the crucial part which basically allows us to interact with the application. So basically the main purpose of the user interface is to, we could say, let the user interact with the application. So this is the main purpose of the user interface. Now the next most important component of our Android application is nothing but the actual logic which is used in order to, what you could say, perform some action depending upon the user interaction. So the main logic of our Android application is mostly written in Java. So Java is basically one of the crucial languages which we will need to learn in order to understand or in order to develop complex Android applications. And also I forgot a thing like which interface or which language you need to use in order to design the interface. So this is basically the XML. So we'll basically need the XML for the user interface. And for the second part, which is nothing but the logical part, so the main logic behind our application is basically going to decide how our application performs, or we could say how our application responds to user interaction. So basically user interaction is nothing but clicking of buttons, scrolling the app, or pinching the screen, and all those kinds of interactions. Now the logic, like what happens when the user interacts in different manner, is actually written in Java. So Java is basically used to write the logic of our application, and XML is used to design the user interface. So in this tutorial series, our main focus would be on the third part, and the third and the most important part in almost any application is nothing but designing the database so as to store the data related to your application. Now some of the applications are like where you don't need to store data, like the calculator application, in which basically you perform some calculation and you actually don't need to store in much data when you basically exit out of the application. But in most of the applications and in most of the cases, we actually need to use or store data somewhere, either be it in the phone, or let's say we store the data in some online database. But the thing is that we actually need to handle data in a certain Android application. So the most important part of any Android application is learning how to process data and how to actually store the data. So this is the third part, which is called as the data, and that part actually helps us to, you could say, helps to save and manipulate data. So for the logic, the language which we use is nothing but Java, and for the last part, which is nothing but the data part, we use something which is called as PHP and MySql. Now you might be familiar with these languages, and it is actually good if you study these two languages so as to basically what you could say connect your application to a database. And we are also going to learn what are databases. So even if you know what databases are, it would be a good revision for you, like learning what are databases. So whenever we are talking about data for any software, the entire data of any software is actually stored at a position which is called as the database, that is the base of the data. So basically a database is nothing but the collection of data which our application is going to use. Now the data is actually stored in a very organized fashion in a database. So let's say if you want let's say if you are creating an application for a school, so we do not randomly throw data in a database, like each and every information in a database, but instead what we do is that we organize this data in a very proper what you could say format, so that it would be easy for us to actually retrieve the data whenever we want. So the data in the database is actually stored in the form of tables. So let's say you are creating some application in which you want to actually store in the what you could say the first name, the last name, and the login name of a user. So in that case what we could do is that we could create a table, and the rows of a table, or sorry, the columns of a table are going to represent the various attributes such as the login name, the first name, the last name, and the actual rows of these table are basically going to be the entries inside the table. So for example, if we actually want to check if what is the first name of a person who has a login Mark, so in that case we move to this row which has the login name as Mark, and then we check his first name is Samuel. So that's basically how the database works. So in databases we basically store the data organized in a table. So let's say you are creating an Android application in which you want to store the data related to students. So instead of throwing in the data directly into the database, what we do is that we actually create a new table for a student, and in order to list out the properties of the student or the attributes of the student, we design different number of columns for each attribute. So in case of a student, let's say the attributes might be name, the contact, address, the subjects which the student is going to study, the marks obtained by the student, and many other attributes just like that. So basically we create a table and we basically store the entire data in a tabular format into the database. So it's extremely important that we study databases in much more depth, and the main reason for that is in case of Android application, what we could do is that we could use the data, we could store the data on an online database, and we could actually process data, retrieve data, and use the data to our advantage in our Android application. So let's say if you actually want to create an application which actually sends the data to other users, so in that case what we do is that we simply create a database, we create some slots in the database so as to save the data, and we actually save the data into the database. So this was the basic intro, like what databases are. And also one more thing which I would like to mention here is that we actually also need to understand some basic PHP so as to continue with this tutorial. And even if you don't have a basic understanding of PHP, and if you could grasp any programming language quickly, then PHP is not a difficult language to learn, and you could learn PHP along the way in this course as we move along. And also in order to actually perform database operations like insertion, update, delete, and alter, and all the other operations, we are also going to need to learn the MySql queries for inserting, updating, and deleting. And it is very simple, but the only thing is that if you are not aware of these languages or how these things work, so please pay close attention and you will be fine. And also one more thing is that we actually need to have web hosting server so as to make our application run. So in this tutorial we are basically going to use an online server as well as a server or a virtual server which we'll be creating on our computer. There are also some installations which we need to done before even starting this tutorial. So in the next tutorial we'll basically learn how to basically set up a virtual server on our device, or we could say on our personal computer. And we are also going to learn how to use PHP so as to connect the database. We are also going to create a database in the next tutorial, and we are basically going to have an actual look into the database, how the database looks like, how we could store data, or how we could store the tables into the database, and how we could store information inside the table which are actually present in the database. So that's it for this tutorial. So this was the basic intro so as to give you an overview like how databases actually work in an Android application. So basically the main purpose of studying databases is that most of the times when you are creating an Android application for any purpose, you will need to store the data on an online database so that the users could actually retrieve and save the data from the database. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope you guys understood what is the main significance of using the database in our Android applications. And there are actually many methods, or we could say many ways to basically connect your Android application to the database, but for the sake of this course we'll be studying how to actually connect our Android application by using PHP and MySql databases. And we'll be doing it by using the local host, and also we'll try to do this by using the online server. So thank you very much for watching this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thank you.